Very often I'm asked, could the German hyperinflation or the Venezuelan hyperinflation, could something as terrible as that, could that happen again today in the US or in Europe? Experts say it's not possible. We have better tools, we have more competence, we have more experience, we understand the economy better and the financial markets. Don't worry, it will not happen. Well, I'm not that optimistic. It's always possible, and when you watch this video, you will understand why. Let me introduce you to a case study about the German hyperinflation, and you will see that this country went from rock solid, from very strong, to a total disaster. I call that the 10-year rule of disaster because it's a pattern that we have seen in history many times. Any country, and I want you to remember this, any country can go from paradise to hell in less than 10 years. That's the reality. Let's look into this case study. Now, when Germany started in 1913, it was the year of euphoria, everything was going well. People did not know that was the last normal year they will experience for a very, very long time. Less than 10 years later, we had hyperinflation in 1923 and 1924, and unfortunately that was not all. One mega risk came after the other, and that's a pattern that we see in risk management history very, very often. When you get hit with one mega risk, a big risk event, it always has consequences and leads to other mega risk events. And that's what I want to explain to you today. Now, when you try to graph the value of the German currency during the time of hyperinflation, you get a meaningless chart because it looks something like this. It's much more impressive if you look at the actual numbers. That's why I have this table. Just focus on two numbers. I give you two numbers. The value of $1. For $1, you could get 4.5 German marks in 1914. So again, 4.5 German marks in 1914. In 1923, when everything broke apart, hyperinflation was on, and the currency was practically worthless, you could get for $1 4.2 trillion German marks. So you understand the money was typically worthless. It couldn't buy that much anymore. The financial system collapsed. And here you see a picture in 1923. That was the typical thing. You didn't have 1 mark, 2 mark, 5 marks. You had 50 million marks, and later even higher numbers per bill. It was a total disaster. But what I want you to understand is, how can we go from paradise to hell in such a short amount of time? And that's important to understand. And if we understand that, we avoid the mistake in history committed many times, that we approach the future with arrogance and overconfidence. We should not do that. So let me explain where we started in Germany. We started in Germany in 1914 or 1913 as a rock solid and very admired country. We had a long, prosperous and peaceful time. The last war ended in 1871, and until 1914, the start of World War I, we had peace and prosperity. We had a lot of social improvements. The country was very innovative and progressive. 1883, health insurance was introduced. A year later, accident insurance was introduced to protect the workers. Disability insurance was later introduced. So we had very innovative social insurance systems kicking in at a very early time, a sign that the economy was doing well and the government was doing its job to keep everything together and make sure there's some kind of equality in place to protect the workers and help them during that time. We also had an excellent education system back then. Scientists were world known back then that came out of this education system, but also many engineers that later were responsible for all the innovations and for the industry were educated in this system. There was also a strong interest in arts. Berlin was a center in Europe for the arts. And when you look at this situation, at this description, you would say, great country, what's the problem? Now, that's what the Germans thought. In 1913, and again, 1913 was the last complete year that was normal. For a very long time, until the 1950s, you could argue, it was the last normal good year. And it's very interesting, there's a book written about this particular year from Florian Illies. It's called 1913. Highly recommended if you have some time to read through some pages. And what you see is this country, there is no sense of disaster or no anticipation of many years of disaster and hardship coming. And that's the interesting thing. If you ask people today or in 2020, could you imagine something bad coming? Most people would have said, no, we can handle it, and so on. And that was the case in 1913. There was almost some overconfidence there. And that's always a little bit tricky. Now let's look how the situation developed. And then we look at the mega risk chains that developed over time. Between 1914 and 1918, we had World War I. That was the first big mega risk. It was a total disaster for Germany and for the other countries as well, as war always is. But then we had, after the war, a second crisis starting to happen. And it was the polarization of opinions between the left and the right in the political spectrum. In the years to come, the middle ground was more and more deserted. People were either very conservative or very left-wing oriented. And that was a problem because Germany, after the war, just introduced its first real democracy. And that democracy was struggling at an early time with this polarization of opinions, and both sides were really angry at the other. There was a lot of aggressive debate and a lot of violence also between these sides. Then, between 1919 and 1924, we had the hyperinflation. First inflation, extreme inflation, and then it went out of control in hyperinflation. And not surprising, when you have such a turbulent time, another mega risk could happen. A revolutionary coup from one of the extreme parts. What happened in November 1923, somebody called Adolf Hitler staged his first attempt to take over government in Germany. It was the so-called Bierkeller Putsch. In English you would say beer hall coup. It started literally in a beer hall in Munich, and there were politicians there, and Hitler with his forces tried to take over control, and his goal was to go to Berlin and assume power. Now the coup failed and Hitler was jailed, but he was early released. He didn't have to stay in prison for the whole time. They released him early. And you can imagine how history is starting to deteriorate for Germany during that time. The next step was, after the Bierkeller Putsch, 1924, 1929, it was an okay time in Germany. There was some normalization, but it was definitely not the great time that we had before the war, before World War I in 1913 and before. But then came the next economic hit, the next mega risk, and that was the Great Depression, and that hit Germany really hard. And that really led through later to Adolf Hitler also becoming Reichskanzler, the leader of Germany, and the end of the Weimar Republic, the end of democracy. Then we had World War II, the Holocaust, and massive destruction. 1945, Germany hit rock bottom. It was totally destroyed. It was occupied, isolated, desperate. And then 1949, a new start started with the new constitution being put in place, the Grundgesetz. But what I want you to understand is, in 1913, if you go back again, no one would have anticipated how bad the next 30, 40 years could be. And that's always something that the mistake that we do in risk management, that we underestimate. If we had good times, we cannot imagine that the next years will be bad, because we have a linear extrapolation. Most of us, also politicians and experts in economics and financial markets and in business, there's always the tendency to extrapolate the future from the recent past. And these structural breaks that sometimes happen with a risk event, a mega risk event, and that leads to another and another and another, and a total deterioration, people have problems to imagine that. That's why, unfortunately, we have these 10-year rules to disaster. Now, people always ask me, well, if I was in Germany, what would have helped me actually to protect myself, or at least to protect my financial health during that time? Well, given that the problem was mainly centered in Germany, and that's a little bit different today, we have inflation everywhere, but what would have helped back then during the German hyperinflation was foreign currencies, US dollar, British pound. A little bit later, it was prohibited to have personal possession of foreign currencies over a certain limit. Foreign stocks would have helped. Obviously, real assets, precious metals, gold, silver, and agricultural land, real estate, private gardens. That was actually an important thing, to have a private garden that you can grow some food to help a little bit in these terrible times. Emigration to other countries would have been also a good strategy back then to escape the hyperinflation, because inflation is very rarely a very short period. Inflation very often stretches for 5 to 10 years and longer. You don't get rid of it that easily. So immigration is always a strategy to consider. And then also mission critical careers. That's one experience from the hyperinflation period. A farmer is mission critical, right? A plumber is mission critical. If something leaks, you need to pay the plumber, and the plumber can demand inflation adjusted compensation, right? If you work as a museum director, for example, there's actually in one of the books I read on the hyperinflation a very sad story that this museum director had a great apartment because it was rent controlled, but when an American visited him, he had hardly any food. He couldn't afford any food. So that's the lesson learned from back then. There are some strategies that help, but keep in mind, when you have high inflation and hyperinflation, it's a very tough time, and very often there are rules put in place that prohibit you to own things like foreign currencies or gold. The government gets very restrictive on these things. And also to understand that even if you had real estate back then, there were laws that you couldn't raise the rent that much, right? So you own a property that is inflation protected, but the cash flows might not be inflation protected. I hope you enjoyed that video. I wanted to explain a little bit the 10-year rule to disaster, and that we should not be overconfident. We should really focus on doing our work to basically get inflation under control. I released another video where you see my recommendations how governments can control inflation based on my study of inflation periods in the past. I hope you enjoyed it. I'm happy if you subscribe to my channel and return and watch more of my content. And if you have any comments, use the comment section. Thank you very much.